NBA offseason grades, the Western Conference. Starting off with the Dallas Mavericks, they had a fairly disappointing offseason. So at the draft, they picked Jaden Hardy at 37, which was actually a solid pick as he was the consensus 25th best prospect. They also scooped up Mahamadou Gueye. But it was the other moves that were really consequential for the Mavericks. They did not re-sign Jalen Brunson. They let him basically walk for nothing and sign with the New York Knicks. They also lost Sterling Brown, Trey Burke, Marquise Chris, Boban Marjanovic, and Moses Wright. They acquired, however, Christian Wood, JaVale McGee, Tyler Dorsey, McKinley Wright IV, and then they re-signed Theo Pinson. So obviously the two big acquisitions were Christian Wood and JaVale McGee, both nominally centers, and it's unclear at this point whether or not they'll be starting together or whether or not Wood will be coming off the bench. Either way, I don't love it for the Mavericks because Wood is the superior talent and McGee is a fantastic backup big man, but as a starting big man alongside Luka Doncic for a team that was just in the Western Conference Finals, that might be a bridge too far. And anyways, it's unclear whether or not Christian Wood can elevate his game to be a good player for a good team because he's never had this opportunity. He has, throughout his career thus far, been on really bad teams. He's been sort of the prototypical good stats, bad team player. So can he elevate his game to play on a really good team in the Dallas Mavericks and provide that spacing for the heliocentric Mavericks offense? We shall see. And can he fit alongside JaVale McGee as well? The other big move that the Dallas Mavericks made this offseason was not re-signing Jalen Brunson, who was just their second best player on their way to the Western Conference Finals. It was a bit of a head-scratcher, to be sure. They didn't want to overpay him, but allowing him to just walk for nothing is definitely a mismanagement of resources, and whether or not he could be the best or second best player on a championship team is kind of irrelevant at this point because you're still building towards that point. But I think it's clear that he could be the third best player on a championship caliber team. So we're going to go with a C- for the Dallas Mavericks. Getting Christian Wood will probably turn out to be a fine acquisition, and drafting Jaden Hardy was solid as well, but letting Jalen Brunson go was unforgivable. Next up, we have the Denver Nuggets, and they also had a pretty active offseason, a lot of guys coming in and out. So at the draft, they selected Christian Brown at 21, although he was just the 33rd best prospect, so I didn't love that pick. They also got Peyton Watson at 30, Ishmael Kamagate at 46, and then they grabbed three undrafted players, Colin Gillespie, Adonis Arms, and Kellen Grady. Then they acquired Bruce Brown, Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, Ish Smith, DeAndre Jordan, Jack White, Justin Tillman. They re-signed or extended Nikola Jokic, the two-time reigning MVP, Vlatko Cancar, and Devon Reed. And then they lost Monty Morris, Will Barton, Bryn Forbes, JaMychal Green, Austin Rivers, and Marcus Howard. So lots of guys coming in and out of the roster for the Nuggets. Ultimately, it's going to be a B+ for Denver because obviously signing Jokic to that extension was vital. They also acquired Bruce Brown, which was a really solid pickup. He's been an underrated player for the Nets for several years now. And then I really liked the trade with the Wizards getting Kentavious Caldwell-Pope and Ish Smith, especially KCP. He's going to fit perfectly alongside Jamal Murray in the backcourt for the Nuggets. He's exactly what they needed alongside those four-star offensive players, Jokic, Murray, Porter Jr., and Aaron Gordon. KCP is kind of just going to fit into that starting lineup alongside those four guys. And assuming they all stay healthy, Morris and Barton would have been a little bit duplicative anyways. So locking up Jokic was huge, and bringing in those veterans on the wings to shore up their rotation was also really solid. So I basically liked everything that the Nuggets did except for their draft. None of the players that they took were excess value where they selected them. So I didn't like the draft, but other than that, good stuff for the Denver Nuggets. Moving on, we have the Golden State Warriors, the reigning NBA champions. And you would have liked to see a little bit more activity from the Warriors this offseason. So at the draft, they picked Patrick Baldwin Jr. at 28. They also got Ryan Rollins at 44, Guy Santos at 55, and then two undrafted guys, Trevion Williams and Lester Quinones. They acquired Dante DiVincenzo, JaMychal Green, Mac McClung, Quindary Weatherspoon, and Pat Spencer. Then they re-signed Kevon Looney, but they lost Gary Payton II, Otto Porter Jr., Juan Toscano Anderson, Damian Lee, and Nemanja Bjelica. So it's going to be a C for the Golden State Warriors. That might sound a little harsh considering that they just won the championship, but I frankly didn't really like any of the moves that they made this offseason. Bringing in Dante DiVincenzo, that's fine. But losing Gary Payton II, Otto Porter Jr., JTA, Damian Lee, Nemanja Bjelica, those were all five rotation guys for the Warriors last season, especially Payton and Porter Jr., who were vital even in the playoffs. Re-signing Kevon Looney is fine, but I probably would have prioritized Peyton, whose role was a little bit more indispensable for the Warriors last season. And I didn't really like any of the guys that they drafted either, other than Ryan Rollins at 44, so I was a little bit disappointed by this offseason for the defending champs, the Golden State Warriors. Next up, we have the Houston Rockets, and they had one of the best off seasons of any team in the NBA. Granted, the task for a rebuilding team like the Rockets is significantly different than what the Warriors had to achieve, and I would argue that it's more difficult to really knock it out of the park if you are a championship caliber team like the Warriors than it is for the Rockets, who really just need to nail their draft picks. But that's exactly what they did, so credit where credit is due. The Rockets' incredible offseason started with the draft, so they took Jabari Smith Jr. with the number 3 pick, and this was a coup for the Rockets because coming into the draft, he was the consensus number 1 prospect for most analysts. It feels like this has gotten lost in the shuffle a little bit as Banchero ended up going 1 and then had a solid summer league, but I'm not going to forget the fact that Smith Jr. was clearly one of the best prospects, if not the best, coming into the draft, so the fact that the Rockets were able to get him at 3 is a huge get. They also picked Tari Eason at 17, who was projected as the 14th best prospect, Ty Washington at 29, he was the projected 16th best prospect, and then they also picked up Trevor Hudgens, who was an undrafted rookie. So all things considered, an incredible draft for the Houston Rockets, and that's the most important thing for a rebuilding team. In terms of other moves they made, they lost Trevelin Queen and John Wall. They also traded Christian Wood to the Mavericks, and they didn't get a ton back for him, but I don't think his trade value was very high anyways. They got several guys in the doors: Sterling Brown, Trey Burke, Willie Cauley-Stein, Marquise Chris, and Boban Marjanovic, most of whom came over from the Mavericks. And then they also re-signed Jayshawn Tate and Bruno Fernando, and retaining Tate was also a solid move. So it's going to be an A+ for the Houston Rockets. I pretty much liked everything that they did, especially the draft, which is the most important thing for a rebuilding team, and they could not have done better in that regard. Alright, moving on to the LA Clippers, and they had a pretty solid offseason. So, they selected Moussa Diabate at the draft with the 43rd pick, although he was only the 74th best prospect, so I didn't love that. But they did acquire veteran point guard John Wall from the aforementioned Houston Rockets. And while I didn't really mind the Rockets letting Wall go, I do think he could be a valuable addition to this veteran team, the LA Clippers. He's probably going to be coming off the bench behind Reggie Jackson, and if he can stay healthy and engaged, he will absolutely be one of the best backup point guards in the NBA. They also acquired Moses Brown. They re-signed or extended Ivica Zubac, Robert Covington, Nick Batum, Amir Coffey, and Xavier Moon. So that was a really solid series of moves. Covington especially is a vital key wing defender, and Ivica Zubac is one of their only big men on the roster, so that was vital as well. And then they lost Isaiah Hartenstein and Jay Scrubb. So overall, it's going to be a B+ for the LA Clippers. I really liked the re-signings that they did and acquiring John Wall. I didn't really love their draft pick, and losing Hartenstein is going to suck because he was low-key one of the best backup big men in the NBA last season. But nonetheless, overall, it was still a solid offseason for the championship contenders, the LA Clippers. As for the Clippers' crosstown rivals, the Lakers, I was a little bit more underwhelmed by what they did this offseason. So first, at the draft, they picked Max Christie with the 35th pick. He was projected as the 37th best prospect, so I didn't really love that one. And then they got 4 undrafted guys in Scottie Pippen Jr., Cole Swider, Javonte McCoy, and Fabian White. None of those really moved the needle either. In terms of player acquisitions, they brought a lot of guys in: Patrick Beverley, Lonnie Walker IV, Thomas Bryant, Damian Jones, Troy Brown Jr., Jay Huff, and Juan Toscano Anderson. In terms of re-signing or extending current players, there was just one, but it was a big one. They extended LeBron James on a 2-year, $97 million contract extension through the 24-25 season, which makes him the highest paid player in the league. And then in terms of players they lost, Malik Monk, Kent Bazemore, Mac McClung, Talen Horton-Tucker, and Stanley Johnson. So overall, we're going with a C for the LA Lakers. If it wasn't for extending LeBron James, this would have been a really underwhelming offseason. I did not like their draft. I didn't really love a lot of the players that came in. Lonnie Walker IV has shown very little for the Spurs, and Patrick Beverley, getting him for Talen Horton-Tucker is a fine move, but he is 34 and he does next to nothing on offense. And losing Malik Monk hurts as well because he was low-key one of their better players last season, especially offensively. So it's really just the LeBron James extension that salvages this offseason for the Lakers a little bit. Next up, we have the Memphis Grizzlies, and they also had a bit of a disappointing offseason in my opinion. So first, at the draft, they were very active. They brought in Jake LaRavia with the 19th pick. He was the projected 24th best prospect, though. David Roddy with the 23rd pick. Once again, losing value. He was the 39th best prospect. Kennedy Chandler at 38, that was a solid pick, as he was the 27th best prospect. And then Vince Williams Jr. at 47, and then two undrafted guys, Kenny Lofton and Jacob Gilyard. So I liked the Lofton pickup as an undrafted guy, and then I liked Kennedy Chandler at 38, but I didn't really like any of the other picks. In terms of acquisitions, they got Danny Green and Dakota Mathias. They got Danny Green because they traded DeAnthony Melton to this Philadelphia 76ers, and that was a move that I really did not like for the Grizzlies. He was a valuable 3-and-D rotation player for them, and losing him for not that big of a return is a bit of a head-scratcher in my opinion. And then they also lost Kyle Anderson for nothing, which is disappointing as well, as he was another rotation guy for them. They lost East Pons as well. However, like the Lakers, the re-signings or extensions is what salvaged the offseason for the Grizzlies. They were able to lock up their star point guard, Ja Morant, as well as the backup point guard, Tyus Jones, and sharpshooter John Conchar. So ultimately, it's going to be a C+ for the Grizzlies. I really didn't like most of their draft, and I really didn't like losing Anderson and Melton, but getting Morant and Jones back was definitely solid, and I did like the Kenny Lofton and Kennedy Chandler picks. Okay, moving on to the Minnesota Timberwolves. They had one of the most consequential off seasons of any team in the league. So, first, at the draft, they picked Wendell Moore at 26 and Josh Minott at 45. I didn't really like the Moore pick, but I did like the Minott pick. So, who did they acquire? Well, just a player by the name of Rudy Gobert. They traded a boatload of first-round picks and a ton of key rotation guys to get the 3-time Defensive Player of the Year center. It was a huge move by the Timberwolves, taking advantage of the Utah Jazz's sudden rebuild, and it is very much up in the air as of right now whether or not Gobert and Towns will be able to coexist together in the starting lineup. They both play center, so I guess they'll be moving Towns down to the 4 and Gobert at the 5, and it makes sense in a certain sense as Gobert is the defensive stalwart, whereas Towns is the offensive guy. However, I just don't know if that's maximizing either of their skill sets, and I don't know if Towns will be able to guard 4s. Obviously, Gobert will be able to help in that regard, but still, the fit just doesn't really seem optimal in my opinion. But with that being said, bringing in a multiple-time all-star player and a 3-time Defensive Player of the Year can't hurt, and their defense, at least in the regular season, should be much improved with Gobert anchoring it. They also brought in Kyle Anderson. That was a solid pickup. They also got Bryn Forbes, Eric Paschall, Austin Rivers, CJ Elleby, and AJ Lawson. In terms of re-signings or extensions, well, they re-signed the aforementioned Karl Anthony Towns and also Taurean Prince and Nathan Knight. So a lot of activity for the Timberwolves this offseason. Obviously, extending Towns was a really solid move. And then in terms of players they lost, Malik Beasley, Patrick Beverley, Jared Vanderbilt, Leandro Bolmaro, and Josh Okogie all going out the doors, mostly in the Rudy Gobert trade. And it's going to be interesting to see how they fare, because that's another aspect of this trade, is they lost a lot of key rotation guys. Beasley, Beverley, Vanderbilt, all key rotation players for the Timberwolves. So ultimately, we're going to go with a B-. I liked the Gobert trade in theory, but I don't know if I like the fit alongside Towns. They gave up a lot to get him, especially the picks going forwards. But with all that being said, they will almost certainly be a much improved team, especially in the regular season next year. All right, moving along to the New Orleans Pelicans, and they had a much more low-key offseason. In fact, they did very little, really. So at the draft, they picked Dyson Daniels with the number 8 pick, and coming into the draft, he was the number 8 prospect, so that makes sense. Then they got one of the biggest steals of the draft in E.J. Liddell with the 41st pick, because coming in, he was the 21st best prospect, so that is a huge steal. And then they also picked up Daquan Plowden as an undrafted rookie. Other than that, they basically did nothing, no players coming in or out, other than extending their star forward, Zion Williamson. And normally, I wouldn't attribute too much credit to the team for extending their star player, because it's kind of obvious, it's a no-brainer. But in the case of Zion, it was definitely not a no-brainer, as there was a lot of question marks around whether or not he would want to stay with the Pelicans, whether or not he would be healthy enough to play. I mean, it's just been such a topsy-turvy last few months for the Pelicans. So getting Zion locked up for another several years is a really solid move, and hopefully, for their sake, he's going to be all the way healthy and back to normal for the regular season, which I think he should be. So it's going to be an A- for the Pelicans. It was definitely a low-key offseason, but what they did do was all good, especially extending Zion and the E.J. Liddell pick at 41. All right, moving along to the Oklahoma City Thunder. And they also had a really solid offseason, but they were a little bit more active than the Pelicans. So at the draft, their big move was taking Chet Holmgren at number 2. And coming into the draft, he was the second best prospect, so that makes sense. But a lot of people were really high on Chet, and they actually had him as the best prospect. So I think that was a good move. Yes, he did get injured, and yes, he will miss all of his rookie season, but frankly, I don't think that matters all that much in the long term. He should make a full recovery from this foot injury and be back and better than ever next year. So that was a good pick. They also got Ousmane Dieng with the 11th pick. He was projected as the 18th best prospect, but he definitely has potential. Then they got Jalen Williams with the 12th pick, and although he was projected as the 20th pick, a lot of people were really high on Williams, and he had a fantastic summer league. And then they also got the other Jalen Williams at the 34th pick. So all things considered, I think it was a pretty solid draft for the Thunder. And then in terms of other moves, they also acquired Eugene Omoruyi and Sasha Killia-Jones. They re-signed or extended Lugans Dort, Mike Muscala, and Kenrich Williams, all three talented guys. And then they lost Isaiah Roby, JaMychal Green, and Xavier Simpson. I didn't love losing Roby for nothing, but they couldn't really fit him on the roster anymore, so it's going to be an A- for the Thunder. The biggest move was the Chet pick, and I do think he has star potential, and I liked some of the other picks that they made and the re-signings, so good stuff overall for OKC. Next up, we have the Phoenix Suns. And this is a franchise that has made headlines several times over the past year or so, mostly for negative reasons. So first of all, we've had this Robert Sarver saga going on, but it seems like he's going to sell the team, so that's good. Then they also had the DeAndre Ayton saga, will he or won't he re-sign? Well, he ended up re-signing, so that was good. And then they also had the unceremonious playoff defeat to the Dallas Mavericks. That was definitely bad. But let's just move on to the actual moves they made this offseason. So first off, they did not draft or pick up any rookies. But in terms of player acquisitions, they brought in Damian Lee, Josh Okogie, Jock Landale, and Dwayne Washington Jr., all of whom are end-of-the-bench, just sort of rotation players, so I wasn't really that impressed with any of those. However, it was who they re-signed and extended that was the big moves this offseason. So it was Devin Booker, DeAndre Ayton, Bismack Biyombo, and Ish Wainwright. Now, Booker, that one was a no-brainer, but it was good to get him locked up nonetheless. Ayton, however, this was a controversial one. They were hesitant to offer the former number 1 pick that max extension. They did, however, offer his fellow draftee Mikal Bridges one last offseason, so it was definitely an acrimonious relationship there for quite some time, and it even seeped into the actual on-court product, it seemed like at times. Ultimately, he went on the free market and got an offer from the Indiana Pacers, which the Phoenix Suns eventually just matched. So it ended up being much ado about nothing, and Ayton is now playing the good soldier, but it does seem like there could be some residual ill will from Ayton towards the Suns organization, and I'll be interested to see whether or not he stays with them after this next contract ends. Then finally, in terms of players they lost, JaVale McGee, Aaron Holiday, Frank Kaminsky, and Gabriel Lundberg went out the door. So it's going to be a B- for the Suns. You could go lower because they didn't really do that much to improve their team other than the re-signings, but they were for very important players in Booker and Ayton, and I think they definitely made the right move in the end, extending Ayton. Alright, moving on to the Portland Trailblazers. So first, at the draft, the Trailblazers picked Shaedon Sharpe with the 7th pick. This was a really solid pickup because he was the consensus 5th best prospect. Obviously, he's a bit of a mystery box at this point. He's hardly played at all over the past few years, but he's just got a ton of potential, and so getting him at 7 was solid. They also picked Jabari Walker with the 57th pick, and he was the consensus 47th best prospect, so that was good as well. And then they scooped up Jared Rhoden as an undrafted rookie. In terms of player acquisitions, I think they made several really good moves. They traded for Jeremy Grant from the Detroit Pistons, and they didn't really have to give up that much to get him. It was just basically a middling first-round pick. And then they also signed Gary Payton II, formerly with the Golden State Warriors. He is a defensive stalwart guard, which is just what the doctor ordered for the Trailblazers because they've got 2 defensively liable point guards in Damian Lillard and Anthony Simons. So in the end, it'll be interesting to see whether or not Payton II ends up being the starting guard alongside Lillard in place of Anthony Simons, who had a fantastic year last season. We shall see how that unfolds. Then they also acquired Isaiah Miller and Norvel Pell. In terms of re-signings or extensions, it was the aforementioned backcourt of Lillard and Simons, as well as Yusuf Nurkic and Drew Eubanks. Good to get all of those players locked up. And then they lost Eric Bledsoe, Joe Ingles, and CJ Ellaby, none of whom were really in their long-term plans. So, all things considered, I think this was a solid offseason for Portland. It's going to be an A-. I liked the draft picks, I liked the players they acquired, and I liked the re-signings. All right, next we have the Sacramento Kings. And I think their offseason was pretty similar to the Trailblazers, albeit a little bit more underwhelming. So first, in the draft, they picked Keegan Murray with the 4th pick. And this is a controversial one because a lot of people are really in love with Murray right now, especially after his stellar summer league. But he was the projected 6th best prospect, so I'm not all the way sold with Murray just yet. I still kind of have a feeling they're going to regret not taking Jaden Ivey, so we'll see how that unfolds. And then they also picked up Keon Ellis as an undrafted rookie. That was a solid move because he was the projected 63rd best prospect. Then in terms of other moves, they had several players coming in and out. So first, they acquired Kevin Huerter from the Atlanta Hawks. They did have to send a first-round pick to get him, but I think that was a solid pickup. He is a talented young player. And then they also brought in Malik Monk, Kent Bazemore, Matthew Dellavedova, Casey Okpala, Quinn Cook, Chima Moneke, and Sam Merrill. I think a couple of those guys could really make an impact for the Kings' rotation, especially Malik Monk. In terms of re-signings or extensions, there was just one. It was the big man, Neemias Queta. And then in terms of players they lost, Dante DiVincenzo, Mo Harkless, Justin Holiday, and Damian Jones are all out the door. So it's going to be a straight B for the Kings. I did like some of the players they acquired. The Keegan Murray pick might end up being a solid one, but I just am a little bit worried that they're going to regret not picking Jaden Ivey instead, as I think he has a much higher ceiling. So all in all, it was a solid offseason for the Kings, but not really changing their fortunes that significantly. Next up, we have the San Antonio Spurs, and they are all the way in tank mode now at this point. And so first, at the draft, they picked Jeremy Sohan with the number 9 pick. He was the consensus 10th best pick, but I really liked that pick for the Spurs. I think he was probably the best player available, and he is going to be a really valuable addition for their team moving forwards. They also picked up Malachi Branham with the 20th pick. He was the projected 13th best prospect. Fantastic pick. Blake Wesley with the 25th pick. He was projected as the 19th best prospect, another solid one. And then 2 undrafted guys, Dom Barlow and Jordan Hall, both of whom were in the top 70. So really fantastic draft for the Spurs. I really loved the Barlow undrafted rookie that they picked up, and then all 3 of their top picks were really good too. They also acquired Isaiah Roby and Gorgie Jang. Roby was let go by the Thunder because they couldn't really keep him on the roster anymore, and he has potential to be a solid piece going forwards. In terms of re-signings or extensions, it was pretty much their only veteran left, Keldon Johnson. They extended him on a fairly reasonable deal, so that was a good move. And then in terms of players they lost, this is where they really made a big move. They sent DeJounte Murray to the Atlanta Hawks, their all-star point guard, for a bounty of first-round picks in return. They also got Danilo Gallinari back, but then they waived him. And then they also lost Lonnie Walker and Jock Landale. Walker never really proved much when he was with the Spurs, so they won't sweat losing him. So honestly, I was torn between an A and an A+. They really couldn't have done much better. The only thing that differentiates the Rockets offseason from the Spurs is that the Rockets had the opportunity to draft 3 and get a potential superstar in Jabari Smith. The Spurs didn't have that luxury, but they made the most of what they did have with the 9th, 20th, and 25th picks. So an absolutely solid offseason from the suddenly rebuilding and tanking San Antonio Spurs. All right, and finally, we move on to the Utah Jazz, who suddenly find themselves in a similar boat to the Spurs, a rebuilding, tanking team, and they had one of the most active off-seasons of any team in the entire NBA. So first, in terms of the rookies, they've got Ochai Agbaji, the 14th pick. He was the projected 17th best prospect. Walker Kessler, the 22nd pick, projected as the 26th best prospect. And then they also grabbed Johnny Juzang as an undrafted rookie. In terms of players they acquired, well, let's actually start with the players they lost. So they sent out their 2 all-star players, Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert. Mitchell obviously going to the Cleveland Cavaliers, and Rudy Gobert going to the Minnesota Timberwolves. They got a bevy, a bounty, a bumper crop of first-round picks for both of them together. They are really set up nicely now going forwards with all of the picks that they've got. And then they also traded Royce O'Neal, Daniel House, Juancho Hernan-Gomez, Trent Forrest, Eric Paschall. All of those guys are now out of the door for the Jazz. So almost in full tank mode. They do still have several veterans on the roster, Mike Conley, Jordan Clarkson, and a couple of other guys, which they could potentially move going forwards. We'll see if they do or not, but as of right now, the fact that they're still on the roster is a bit of a detractor for me for their offseason grade. In terms of players they acquired, most of whom came back in the Mitchell and Gobert deals, they've now got Malik Beasley, Jared Vanderbilt, Leandro Bolmaro, Talen Horton-Tucker, Stanley Johnson, Colin Sexton, Lauri Markkanen, Simone Fontecchio, and Paris Bass. A huge haul coming back in return for the Jazz. Some of those guys will probably be moved on or cut by the time the regular season rolls around. So in the end, we went with a B+ for the Utah Jazz. So if you're just looking at the draft picks that they got back for the Mitchell and Gobert trades, they knocked it out of the park. But unfortunately, they didn't just get picks, they also had to bring players back to make the salaries work. And that's where they start to lose a little bit of points for me, because they brought in a ton of talented guys. They gave Colin Sexton a new contract. They also brought in Lauri Markkanen, who's coming off of a fantastic Eurobasket for Finland. And Malik Beasley, Jared Vanderbilt are also solid players, especially defensively. So all of a sudden, the Jazz, who are supposed to be in full tank mode now, have a ton of somewhat talented guys on the roster. Now, don't get me wrong, they're going to be bad this season. But just go through their roster. Their guard rotation is Colin Sexton, Mike Conley, and Jordan Clarkson. Their wings, they've got Malik Beasley and Talen Horton-Tucker. And then their bigs, they've got Lauri Markkanen now and Jared Vanderbilt. That's a solid roster of capable NBA players, and I just fear that they're going to be a little bit too good still to fully tank like the Spurs will. They could still move some of those guys by the time the regular season rolls around, but at this point, I'm a little bit worried about their prospects in terms of the full rebuild, so that's why we're going with the B+ and not a better grade. And then I didn't really love the rookies either, although to be fair, they didn't actually select Ochai Agbaji. Alright, that'll do it for us today. Thank you so much for tuning in.